Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Before we dive in, please let me know in the comments where you're listening from. She collapsed at his doorstep, a weary soul with one last plea, to be buried in a specific desolate place. But when the lonely rancher gently brushed the dirt from her hand, what he found was not a scar, but a secret deeply etched into her skin, a secret that tied him to his own tragic past and set them both on a path toward a deadly confrontation. Chapter 1. The Weight of a Last Request. The land beyond Jacob Harding's porch was a masterpiece of divine indifference. It was a vast, sun-scorched canvas of red rock and pale dust, where the skeletal arms of Sagaros reached for a sky of hammered blue steel, and the only shade was the fleeting shadow of a circling hawk. This was the Arizona Territory, a place that burned away all but the essentials of a man, leaving behind a core as hard and unyielding as the landscape itself. Jacob, or Jake as he was known to the handful of souls he still spoke to, was a product of this burning. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulder and narrow in the hip, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from the same sandstone cliffs that bordered his property. Lines etched by sun and sorrow radiated from the corners of his pale blue eyes that held the permanent, weary squint of a man who had stared into the abyss and had found it staring back. His ranch, the Rocking H, was a kingdom of solitude. It was a well-run, prosperous operation, a testament to his relentless work ethic. But the house, a sturdy structure of adobe and thick timber, was too large for one man. It was a hollow place, filled with the ghosts of a wife's laughter and a daughter's small footsteps, silenced 5 years prior by a flash flood that had taken everything from him but the land and the aching void in his chest. He had buried them himself, on the small rise overlooking the house, and with them, he had buried his heart. His days were a silent, grinding routine of hard labor, a rhythm designed to leave him too exhausted for thought, for memory. He rose before the sun, worked until it had bled out across the western horizon, and then sat in the profound silence of his empty home, the company of his memories a more constant presence than any living thing. This day was no different. The heat was a physical weight, the air thick and still with the promise of a coming monsoon storm. He was mending a piece of tack on the porch, his large, calloused hands moving with a practiced, economical grace, when he first saw the figure. It was a shimmering distortion in the heat haze on the far horizon, a speck moving with an agonizing slowness across the vast, empty expanse of his lower pasture. It was not a rider. It was someone on foot. No sane person walked in the high desert in the full glare of the afternoon sun. It was suicide. He watched, his initial curiosity slowly hardening into a grim certainty. The figure was staggering, a drunken, lurching dance of pure exhaustion. Several times, it fell, disappearing from sight behind a swell of land, and each time, Jake thought that was the end of it. But each time, the figure would reappear, smaller, slower, but still moving, still crawling towards his ranch with a desperate, single-minded purpose. With a sigh that was part exasperation, part a reluctant stirring of a long-dormant sense of duty, he put down his work, went inside for his canteen, and saddled his horse. A powerful buckskin named Dust Devil. He rode out, not at a gallop, but at a steady, ground-eating trot. He found her a mile from the house. It was a woman, though she was so covered in a fine layer of red dust and grime that her features were almost indistinguishable from the land itself. She was on her hands and knees, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that were more like sobs. Her clothes were little more than torn, sun-bleached rags. Her dark hair was a tangled, matted nest, filled with burrs and bits of dried leaves. A heavy, rolled-up blanket was tied clumsily to her back with a piece of frayed rope. She looked up as his shadow fell over her, and he saw her eyes. They were the color of dark, mossy stones, and they were filled with a weariness so profound it seemed to sink to the very marrow of her bones. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a flicker of something else, a fierce, defiant spark that had refused to be extinguished. "Water," he said, his voice a rough, gravelly thing, rusty from disuse. He dismounted and offered her the canteen. She took it, her hands trembling so violently that he had to steady them for her. She drank, not with the frantic gulps of the desperate, but with a slow, measured control that spoke of an iron will. When she was finished, she handed it back, her eyes never leaving his face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a dry, rasping sound. "Don't thank me yet," he said gruffly. You're still a long way from nowhere. What in God's name are you doing out here? I am looking for a place, she said, her words slow, as if each one were a heavy stone she had to lift. Well, you found it, he said. This is the rocking age. And you're trespassing. The hardness in his voice was a shield, a habit. He didn't want this intrusion. He didn't want this complication. But the woman before him was clearly at the end of her rope. And even his hardened heart was not immune to the raw desperation in her eyes. No, she said, a small, sad smile touching her cracked lips. Not this place. Another. She lifted a trembling, dust-caked hand and pointed towards a distinctive, wind-peaked butte that rose from the plains to the north, on the very edge of his property. There. I need to get there. Jake frowned. He knew the place. The locals called it the Widow's Peaks. It was a desolate, windswept place of no particular significance, other than the fact that it was where the old, original trail of his ranch began. There's nothing out there but rock and snakes, he said. Why would you want to go there? Her gaze became distant, her eyes looking through him, at a memory only she could see. I have a promise to keep, she whispered. And then, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she collapsed in a heap at his feet, the last of her monumental strength finally giving out. With a curse, Jake gathered her up in his arms. She was as light as a bundle of dried sticks. The rolled-up blanket on her back was surprisingly heavy, its weight disproportionate to her own. He carried her to his horse, mounted, and rode back to the ranch, this strange, unconscious woman a fragile, dusty burden in his arms. He laid her on the spare bed in the small room that had once been a nursery. He left her there, closing the door on the problem, and went about his evening chores, the familiar, mindless work a comfort in the face of this unwelcome disruption. But he could not get her out of his mind. Her eyes, filled with that strange, fierce purpose. And her words, I have a promise to keep. Later that evening, the storm broke. The sky turned a violent, bruised purple, and the rain came down in hard, driving sheets. The wind howled, rattling the windows of the house. He checked on her. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow, a faint flush of fever on her dirt-stained cheeks. He sat in his chair by the cold hearth, listening to the storm and the woman's ragged breathing, and he felt a profound and settling sense of unease. It was as if the storm had brought her, a piece of human flotsam washed up on the shore of his solitary island. She awoke just after midnight. He heard a small, frightened cry from the spare room. He went to the door and found her sitting up in the bed, her eyes wide with a feverish, disoriented terror. It's all right, he said, his voice a low rumble. You're safe. She stared at him, recognition slowly dawning in her eyes. The terror receded, replaced by that same, unnerving weariness. The storm, she whispered. It's a bad one, he confirmed. She seemed to shrink into herself, a new, more profound despair settling over her. I'm running out of time, she murmured, more to herself than to him. She began to cough, a dry, racking sound that shook her thin frame. He brought her water, and as she drank, he saw the truth of it. She was not just exhausted. She was sick, a deep, consuming sickness that was burning her up from the inside. She lay back against the pillows, her eyes fluttering shut. Please, she whispered, her voice so faint he had to lean in to hear her. I know I am a stranger to you, and I have nothing to offer, but I am begging you. Take me to the peaks. When you're stronger, he said, his tone placating. No, she insisted, a surprising strength entering her voice. Her eyes opened, and they were burning with the intensity of her fever and her purpose. There is no time. I am dying. I can feel it. It is my final request. My only request. She reached out and her hand, surprisingly strong, gripped his wrist. Lay me to rest right here, she whispered, her voice a raw, desperate plea. And with her other hand, she pointed again, not at the window, not at the butte, but at a spot on the rough map of the territory that hung on his wall. A spot right at the base of the Widow's Peaks. Why, he asked, his voice rough with a bewildered compassion. Why is that place so important? A debt must be paid, she whispered, her eyes beginning to glaze over again. A story must be buried where it began. Please promise me. He looked at the woman, at the fever burning in her eyes, at the absolute, unwavering conviction of her request. It was madness. But it was the madness of a dying soul, and there was a part of him, the old, honorable part he had thought long dead, that could not refuse a dying woman's last wish. "All right," he heard himself say. "I promise." A look of profound, overwhelming relief washed over her face. The tension seemed to drain out of her, leaving her utterly limp. "Thank you," she breathed. Her hands, which she had been holding clasped tightly to her chest, fell open at her sides, palms up. They were caked with a thick layer of grime and dried blood, as if she had fallen on them, hard, on the sharp rocks. He felt a sudden, inexplicable need to clean them, a small, final act of comfort and dignity for her. He took a cloth and the basin of water from the nightstand. He knelt by the bed and gently took her left hand in his. He began to wipe away the grime. As the dirt came away, he saw that the skin of her palm was a mass of calluses and old, faded scars. The hands of a woman who had known a life of hard, unrelenting labor. And then he saw it. Beneath the last layer of dirt, on the soft flesh of her palm, was a mark. It was not a scar. It was a brand. An intricate, beautifully rendered design, so unlike a cattle brand. It was a stylized, soaring hawk, its wings outstretched. A jolt, cold and sharp as a knife, went through him. His breath caught in his throat. He had seen that hawk before. It was a part of a set, a matching pair. His heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat in the silent room. With a hand that was suddenly trembling, he reached for her other hand. He wiped away the dirt. And his heart, which he had thought was a dead, stone-cold thing, quivered. There, on her right palm, was the matching brand. A mountain, its beak sharp and defiant. A hawk over a mountain. He stared at the two brands, on the two separate palms of this dying, stranger woman. He knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that if she were to place her hands together, the two brands would join, a hawk soaring over the peak, to form a single, complete image. An image he had not seen in 5 long, agonizing years. An image he had last seen on the silver clasp of the family journal that his wife had been holding in her hands, the moment before the fire and the flood had consumed her. It was the Harding family crest. Chapter 2. The Ghost of a Crest. The storm outside raged, a symphony of wind and rain, but inside the small, lamplit room, the world had gone utterly, terrifyingly silent. Jed knelt by the bed, the woman's hands limp in his gaze fixed on the brands that seemed to burn with a cold fire on her palms. A hawk, a mountain, the two halves of a whole that had been ripped from his life, the emblem of a past he had thought was lost forever. His mind, usually so clear and pragmatic, became a maelstrom of confusion and a sharp, metallic taste of fear. Logic fought with the impossible reality before him. The Harding crest was a unique, deeply personal thing, designed by his great-grandfather. It existed in only 2 places, on the silver clasp of the family journal, and on the heavy signet ring his father had worn, a ring that was now buried with him. The journal, and the woman holding it, had been swept away by the flood, lost to the churning, muddy waters of the San Pedro River. He had searched for weeks after the waters receded, a madman clawing through miles of debris and mud, looking for any sign, any trace. He had found nothing. The journal, with its generations of Harding family history, its records of births and deaths, its stories of triumphs and sorrows, was gone. And with it, the only physical representation of the crest he had left. And now, here it was, branded onto the flesh of a dying stranger. How? The question was a hammer blow to his soul. Who was this woman? How could she bear the mark of his family? The brands were not fresh, they were old, the scarred tissue long since healed, a permanent part of her. This was not a recent event. A dozen impossible theories warred in his mind. Was she a long-lost relative, a branch of the family he had never known about? Impossible. His father had been an only child, as had he. The Harding line was a straight, tragically short one. Was it a coincidence? A similar design, created by chance? He dismissed the thought as soon as it formed. The detail was too precise, the stylized lines of the hawk's wings, the jagged peak of the mountain. It was an exact replica. The only remaining possibility was a chilling one. Someone had found the journal. Someone had seen the crest. And that someone had, for some dark, incomprehensible reason, burned its image onto this woman's hands. But why? A brand was a mark of ownership. It was a statement of property. Who would claim a woman with the crest of a dead family? He looked at her face, peaceful now in a feverish, and natural sleep. He saw the lines of hardship around her eyes, the proud, stubborn set of her jaw, even in unconsciousness. She was a survivor, but she was also a victim, and the brands she bore were the key to a mystery that was inextricably, terrifyingly, linked to the greatest tragedy of his own life. He gently laid her hands back on the blanket and rose to his feet, his mind racing. Her last request, to be buried at the base of the widow's peaks, it was no longer the strange, sentimental wish of a dying woman. It was a clue. That spot, where the old trail of his ranch began, was less than a quarter-mile from where the flood had ripped through his home, where he had last seen Eliza. The debt she had spoken of, the story that needed to be buried where it began, it was all connected. This woman, this stranger, was a ghost from his past, a living, breathing messenger from the day his world had ended. His grief, which he had kept locked away in a cold, dark corner of his soul for 5 years, came rushing back, not as a dull ache, but as a sharp, piercing agony. The old questions, the ones that haunted his sleepless nights, resurfaced with a new, terrible urgency. The flood had been a freak of nature, a tragic accident. Or had it? The storm had been fierce, but the wall of water that had descended upon his small homestead had been natural. He had always harbored a small, dark seed of doubt, a feeling that something about that day had been wrong. He had been in the high country, rounding up cattle, when the storm had hit. He had raced back, a terrible premonition in his gut, to find his home obliterated, the river a raging monster where his life had once been. He had found his wife's body downstream, days later. His daughter, they had never found her. The official story was that the flood had been caused by a natural dam of debris upstream, which had broken under the strain of the torrential rain. It was a plausible, tragic explanation. But what if it wasn't the whole truth? He looked at the woman in the bed, and he knew, with a cold certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she was the key. Her story, and the story of the brands on her hands, was the story of what had really happened on that terrible day. His promise to her, to lay her to rest, was now a hollow thing. He could not let her die. Not now. Not until he had the answers she carried. His initial, reluctant compassion was now forged into a fierce, desperate resolve. He had to keep her alive. For the next 2 days, as the storm slowly blew itself out, leaving behind a gray, weeping sky, he became her nurse. He fought the fever that consumed her with a grim, single-minded determination. He forced broth and water between her parched lips. He bathed her face with cool cloths. He sat by her bed, a silent, tireless sentinel, listening. She was lost in a delirium, her mind wandering in the shadowy landscapes of her past. She would murmur in her sleep, fragmented sentences, disjointed images. She spoke of dust and of thirst, of endless walking. She spoke a man's name, a name that she seemed to spit out like a cursed thorn. And she spoke of a fire. The fire, she would whisper, her body tensing, her hands clenching into fists, as if to hide the brands from some unseen observer. So much smoke I couldn't breathe. He took the book, The Silver Hawk. Jed's blood ran cold. He took the book, The Silver Hawk. She had been there. She had been there on the day of the fire, the day of the flood. His mind flashed back to that day, to the small details he had tried so hard to forget. The smell of smoke on the air, a smell he had attributed to a lightning strike. The strange, out-of-place hoof prints he had found in the mud near the wreckage of his house, prints that were not from his own horses. The seed of doubt that had been buried in his heart for 5 years began to sprout, growing into a monstrous, thorny vine of suspicion. It wasn't just a flood. It was an attack, a raid. Someone had come to his home. Someone had set a fire. Someone had murdered his family. And this man, Thorne, had taken the journal. But who was the woman? How did she fit into this terrible, emerging puzzle? Was she a captive, a witness, an accomplice? He looked at her pale, vulnerable face, at the raw hardship etched into her very bones. He saw no malice there. He saw only suffering. He saw a victim, a fellow survivor of the same tragedy that had shattered his own life. The storm in the sky finally broke, and the sun returned, weak and watery at first, then with its old familiar, brassy glare. And with the return of the sun, the woman's fever also broke. He was sitting in the chair by her bed, dozing fitfully, when he felt a touch on his hand. He awoke with a start. She was awake, and her eyes were clear. The fever was gone. She was looking at him, her gaze weak, but lucid. "You're awake," he said, his voice a rough, clumsy thing. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Why?" He looked at her, at the brands on her palms, which were resting on the blanket. He knew he could not hide his discovery. The time for secrets was over. He gently took her hand, turning it so the brand of the hawk was visible. "I need you to tell me a story," he said, his voice low and intense. "I need you to tell me where you got this. And I need you to tell me about a man named Thorn. And about a fire." A look of pure, stark terror entered her eyes. The color drained from her face, leaving her ghostly pale. She tried to pull her hand back, to hide, to retreat back into the safety of her silence. "No," he said, his grip gentle but firm. "No more running. Not from me. Not from this." He took her other hand, placing it beside the first, the two halves of the crest a silent, damning testament between them. "This was my family's crest," he said, his voice thick with a grief that was as raw as if it had happened yesterday. "It was lost 5 years ago, on the day my wife and daughter were murdered. And you were there. Now, you are going to tell me everything." The ultimatum hung in the air, a final, irrevocable demand for the truth. The ghost of the crest had led him to the precipice of a terrible revelation. And the woman who lay in his bed, the woman who bore its mark, was about to tell him a story that would either grant him the peace of understanding or plunge him into a new, even deeper hell of vengeance. Chapter 3: The Branded Messenger. The silence that followed Jed's demand was a fragile, crystalline thing, filled with the weight of 5 years of unspoken grief and unanswered questions. The Larifer, that was the name she finally, hesitantly, offered him, lay in the bed, her eyes wide with a trapped, haunted look. His words had been a key, unlocking the very prison she had been fleeing, and now the ghosts of her past were swarming in the small, sunlit room. She looked at her hands, at the brands that seemed to glow with a life of their own, and a deep, shuddering sigh escaped her, the sound of a final, weary surrender. The time for running was over. The story, the heavy, toxic burden she had carried across 100 miles of unforgiving desert, had to be told. "His name is Marcus Thorn," she began, her voice a low, raspy whisper, the sound of dust and disuse. "And he is not a man. He is a predator who wears a man's skin." Jed pulled the chair closer to the bed, his large frame hunched forward, his attention absolute. He did not interrupt. He did not question. He simply listened, his face a mask of stone, his pale blue eyes the only sign of the storm of emotion that was raging within him. Her story came out in fragments at first, a broken mosaic of memory and pain. She spoke of a childhood spent in a small, forgotten settlement in the shadow of the Dragun Mountains, a place of dust and poverty. She had been an orphan, raised by a harsh but decent woman who ran the local cantina. She was a nobody, a girl with no name and no future. And then, Marcus Thorn had ridden into her life. He was like a king, she whispered, her eyes losing focus, seeing a past that was more vivid than the present. He was beautiful, in a sharp, dangerous way, like a polished dagger. He wore fine clothes, and his saddle was trimmed with silver. He spoke with a voice that was like dark honey, a voice that could make you believe in heaven while he was leading you straight to hell. Thorn was a land baron, a man who was carving out an empire in the territory through a combination of shrewd business, intimidation, and ruthless violence. He had come to their small settlement with an offer to buy up the land, an offer that was, in reality, a demand. He wanted everything, Alara said. The land, the water rights, the people. He saw the world as his personal collection, and he wanted to own it all. It was there, in that dusty cantina, that he had first seen her. She was 15, a young woman on the cusp of a wild, untamed beauty. And he, the great collector, had decided that he wanted to add her to his collection. "He didn't court me," she said, a bitter, humorless smile touching her lips. "He bought me. He paid the woman who raised me a handful of gold coins, a sum that was more money than she had ever seen. She wept when I left. But she was a practical woman. She knew you couldn't fight a man like Marcus Thorn. He had taken her to his ranch, the sprawling, fortified hacienda he called Serpent's Crest. It was a place of stunning beauty and suffocating oppression. He had given her fine dresses, jewels, a life of idle luxury. She was his prize, his pet, the beautiful, and touched wild thing that he kept in a gilded cage. He was obsessed with history, she continued, her voice growing colder, harder. With lineage. He came from nothing, and he despised his own roots. He wanted to create a dynasty, to steal a history for himself. He collected old things, maps, artifacts, family histories. He was trying to buy a past. And that was how he had come to know of the Hardings. He learned of your family, she said, her gaze finally meeting Jed's. He heard the stories of your great-grandfather, a pioneer, a man of honor. He became obsessed with your lineage, with the Harding name. He saw it as the one thing he could never have, a genuine, respected legacy. So, he decided to take it. Her story then turned to the day that Jed's world had ended. He had been watching your ranch for weeks, she said. He knew your routines. He knew you would be in the high country that day. He came with 10 of his men. I was with him. He made me come. He said he wanted me to witness the birth of his new legacy. She described the raid with a chilling, detached clarity, as if she were watching it happen to someone else. They had ridden down to the small homestead. Thorne's men had been brutal and efficient. They had come for one thing, the family journal. Your wife Eliza, Laura's voice broke, the first crack in her detached facade. She was brave. She stood on the porch, holding the book to her chest, and she refused to give it to him. She called him a thief and a coward. Thorne, enraged by this defiance, had struck her. In the struggle, a lantern was knocked over. The fire had started, spreading with terrifying speed through the dry timber of the house. He got the book, Elara whispered, her body trembling with the memory. His men were grabbing what they could. And then they heard the roar. The river. The storm in the mountains had broken the natural dam. A wall of water was coming. In the chaos, as Thorne and his men fled, Elara had seen the small child's daughter, Sarah, trapped on the porch, the flames behind her, the rising water in front of her. I tried, she sobbed, the tears finally breaking free, hot and heavy. I tried to get to her. But he dragged me away. He pulled me onto his horse, and he rode. He left her there. He just left her. The story was a knife in Jed's heart, twisting, turning, laying open the wound that had never truly healed. It wasn't just a flood. It was murder. A cold, calculated act of a man so consumed by envy that he would destroy an entire family to steal a piece of their history. He said nothing, his own grief a suffocating shroud. He let her continue. After that, she said, her voice a dead, empty thing, he changed. The obsession with the Harding crest became a madness. He had the journal, the stories, but he wanted more. He wanted to make the crest his own. And that was when he had branded her. He told me that since he had destroyed the Harding line, he would resurrect it, in his own image, she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of horror and revulsion. He said that I would be the mother of his new dynasty, and that I would bear the mark of the family I had helped to erase. He held me down and he burned your family's history into my skin. It was his ultimate act of possession, his final victory over you. She was sobbing freely now, her body racked with the guilt and the horror of it all. I was a coward, she choked out. I was there. I did nothing. I let him take me. I am as guilty as he is. Jed finally moved. He reached out, not with anger, but with a profound, heartbreaking tenderness, and he wiped the tears from her cheek with his thumb. No, he said, his voice a low, rough whisper, thick with his own tears. You were a child. You were a prisoner. You were a victim. The guilt is his, and his alone. He looked at her, this branded messenger, this fellow survivor of his life's greatest tragedy, and the last of the ice around his heart melted away. The anger was still there, a cold, hard stone of vengeance. But it was now overshadowed by a powerful, overwhelming wave of love and a fierce, protective instinct for this broken, beautiful woman who had carried his family's story, and her own terrible burden, for so long. He now understood her final request. To be buried at the base of the Widow's Peaks was her attempt at atonement, an effort to bury the story, and her own guilt, at the scene of the crime. You're not going to die, Elara, he said, his voice a fierce, unbreakable promise. You're not going to be buried there. He is. I am going to find Marcus Thorne, and I am going to take back what he stole from my family. And then I am going to bury him in an unmarked grave, and the world will forget his name. He stood up, a new, terrible purpose blazing in his eyes. The grieving, solitary rancher was gone forever. In his place was an avenger, a man with a target, a man with a reason to live, and a reason to kill. But first, he said, his gaze softening as he looked down at her, "We are going to get you well. We are going to get you strong. Because when I go after him, I'm not going alone. This is your fight, too. This is our fight. And we are going to finish it together." The truth, as ugly and as painful as it was finally out in the open. It was a truth that had shattered the foundations of Jed's world, but it had also given him something he had not had in 5 long years, a target for his rage, and a partner in his quest for vengeance. The story had been told. The next chapter would be written in blood. Chapter 4: The Forge of Vengeance. The telling of Alar's story was a painful, necessary surgery. It cut away the rot of the past, leaving behind a raw, clean wound that could finally begin to heal. The shared knowledge of their common enemy, Marcus Thorne, forged a new, unbreakable bond between them. They were no longer a rancher and a refugee. They were allies, partners in a singular, deadly purpose to bring Thorne to justice, a justice that would not be found in a courtroom, but at the end of a rope or the barrel of a gun. Alar's physical recovery was slow, but her spiritual recovery began almost immediately. In sharing her burden with Jed, in having him absolve her of her guilt, a lifetime of shame began to fall away. The brands on her hands were still there, a permanent reminder of her past, but they no longer felt like a mark of her own defilement. They were a declaration of war, a map that would lead them to their final reckoning. Jed's transformation was more dramatic. The weary, aimless grief that had defined him was burned away, replaced by a white-hot, focused rage. He had a purpose again, a reason to rise in the morning that went beyond the simple, grinding routine of survival. He was a man with a mission, and that mission had given him his life back, even as it propelled him towards a potentially fatal confrontation. His first priority was Alar's strength. "Vengeance is a long ride," he told her, his voice grim. "You need to be strong enough to see it through to the end." He began a careful, methodical regimen to rebuild her health. He fed her rich broths and fresh milk. He would not let her do any work, forcing her to rest in the sun on the porch, letting the clean, dry air of the high desert do its healing work. But he was also healing her spirit. He began to talk to her about his wife, about his daughter. He shared his memories, not as a source of pain, but as a way of introducing her to the family she was now inextricably linked to. He showed her the small, hand-carved toys he had made for his daughter, the rocking chair he had built for his wife. He was sharing his past with her, making her a part of it, and in doing so, he was robbing Thorne of his victory. Thorne had tried to erase the Hardings, but here, in this small adobe house, they were more alive than ever. As Alar's physical strength returned, a new phase of their partnership began. Jed knew that when they went after Thorne, she could not be a liability. She had to be an asset. She had to be as hard, as resilient, as the land itself. "You're going to learn," he told her one morning, leading her out to the corral. "You're going to learn to ride like the wind, and you're going to learn to shoot like the devil himself." He chose a horse for her, a spirited, intelligent mare with a coat the color of fire. "Her name is Ember," he said. "She's got a gentle mouth, but a heart full of fire. A bit like you." The riding lessons were the beginning of Alar's transformation. At first, she was timid, and used to the power and freedom of being on horseback. But under Jed's patient, expert tutelage, she quickly learned. He taught her not just to ride, but to become one with the horse, to feel its movements, to anticipate its every step. Soon, she was no longer just a passenger, but a rider, her body moving in perfect sync with the powerful animal beneath her. The feeling was intoxicating, a sense of freedom and control she had never known. Then came the shooting lessons. He started her with a rifle, teaching her its mechanics, its weight, its deadly purpose. He was a demanding teacher, forcing her to practice for hours in the hot sun until her shoulders ached and her arms trembled. But she never complained. Every shot she fired, every tin can she sent flying from a fence post, was an act of rebellion against the helplessness she had felt for so long. She was forging herself into a weapon, and the sound of the rifle was the sound of her own chains breaking. But it was the pistol that truly became hers. Jed gave her a small, lightweight Colt, its handle worn smooth. "This was Eliz's," he said, his voice quiet. She never had to use it. I pray you won't either. But I'd rather you have it and not need it, than need it and not have it. She took to the pistol with a natural, deadly grace. She was fast, her eye true. There was a grim satisfaction in the feel of the gun in her hand, in the tight, controlled explosion of its report. She would practice her draw over and over, until the motion was a fluid, unconscious blur. The helpless girl who had been branded was being replaced, day by day, by a woman who could put a bullet through a silver dollar at 20 paces. They were a strange, isolated pair, living in their own private world, their days defined by this single, all-consuming purpose. The bond between them deepened into a powerful, unspoken love. It was a love forged not in soft words and gentle courtship, but in the shared grit of their training, in the smoke of gunpowder, in the silent, mutual understanding of the darkness they were preparing to face. The physical desire between them was a constant, simmering fire, held in check only by the gravity of their mission. There was an unspoken understanding that their own personal future could not begin until the debt of the past had been paid. One evening, after a long day of training, they were cleaning their weapons by the firelight, the familiar, rhythmic clicks and scrapes the only sound in the quiet house. "Are you afraid?" Alara asked, her voice a low murmur. Jed looked up, his face serious in the flickering light. "Of Thorn? No, I don't feel fear. I just feel a great and terrible calm. He's a problem that needs to be solved. A snake that needs its head cut off." He paused, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "I'm afraid of losing you," he admitted, his voice a rough whisper. "That's the only thing in this world that frightens me now." "You won't lose me," she said, her own voice fierce with a conviction that was absolute. "We will finish this, Jed, together. And then we will come back here. And we will live." The word live hung in the air between them, a promise of a future they were fighting for, a future that was no longer a vague, impossible dream, but a tangible, achievable goal. Their final preparation was to gather information. They could not ride into Thorn's territory blind. "He'll be at Serpent's Crest," Alara said. "It's his fortress. But he has other business. Saloons, mining interests. He moves around. We need to know where he is, and what his strength is." Jed knew he couldn't just ride into the nearest town and start asking questions. Thorn's influence was wide, his network of spies and paid men extensive. They needed an advantage. And Alara, the girl Thorn had tried to turn into his tool, was the one who provided it. "He has a weakness," she said, a new, cunning light in her eyes. "He's arrogant. And he's greedy. There's a poker game, a high-stakes one, that happens once a month in a town called Redemption. It's run by a man Thorn trusts. All the big players in the territory go there. Thorn would never miss it. It's a chance for him to exert his power, to fleece the other men, to remind everyone who the king is." "And when is this game?" Jed asked, a slow, dangerous smile beginning to form on his face. "In 3 days," she replied. The plan was set. They would not go to Serpent's Crest. They would not charge into his fortress. They would go to Redemption. They would meet him on neutral ground. They would use his own arrogance, his own greed, as a weapon against him. They spent the next 2 days in a final, intense flurry of preparation. They packed light, taking only what they needed: weapons, ammunition, water, and the small sack of gold coins Jed had saved over the years. On the morning of the 3rd day, they were ready. They stood by their horses, the rising sun casting their long shadows across the yard. This was it. They were leaving the sanctuary of their valley and riding into the heart of the Serpent's territory. Jed looked at Alara. She was no longer the broken, dusty refugee he had found. She was dressed in practical buckskins, a pistol strapped to her hip, a rifle in the scabbard of her saddle. Her hair was tied back in a single, neat braid. Her face was calm, her eyes clear and hard. She was a warrior. He mounted his horse, Dust Devil. She mounted Ember. They looked at each other, a final, silent exchange of promises. Then, without a word, they turned their horses and rode out, side by side, two avenging angels riding into the rising sun, on their way to a town called Redemption, and a final, deadly game with a man who had taken everything from them both. Chapter 5: The Serpent's Den. The town of Redemption was a liar. It sat in a dusty bowl of a valley, or a festering sore on the face of the territory. Its name promised salvation, but its single, White Street offered only temptation and ruin. It was a town built on the unholy trinity of the frontier, whiskey, cards, and greed. Redemption was a place where fortunes were lost on the turn of a single card, where lives were ended over a misplaced word, and where a man's soul was the cheapest commodity for sale. It was, in short, Marcus Thorne's kind of town. Jed and Alara rode in at dusk, when the town was just beginning to stir to its nocturnal life. The brutal heat of the day was giving way to a cooler, more perfumed evening air, thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, frying meat, and the ever-present dust. The windows of the saloons glowed with a hellish, golden light, and the tinny, discordant sound of a piano battled with the shouts of drunken men. They rode with a quiet, watchful purpose, their faces grim, their eyes taking in every detail. This was the Serpent's Den, and they were walking into it willingly. They drew more than a few curious stares. A man and a woman, riding in together, both armed, both carrying themselves with a dangerous, cold intensity. It was not a common sight, even in a town like Redemption. They took a room at the back of the most discreet-looking hotel, a place that seemed to specialize in patrons who did not wish to be noticed. Jed paid in cash, signing the register with a false name. In the small, cramped room, they went over the plan one last time. "The game is at the Serpent's Scepter," Alara said, the name of Thorne's most opulent saloon leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. "It's in a private room, upstairs. The only way in is with an invitation, or a buy-in of $1,000. Jed laid the small, heavy sack of gold coins on the rickety table. It was nearly his life savings. "Then $1,000 it is," he said, his voice grim. "You can't go in there alone, Jed," Alara said, a new, hard edge to her voice. "His men will be everywhere. They'll know you're a stranger. They'll be on you before you even get to the table." "And you think they'll just let you walk in?" he countered. A strange, cold smile touched her lips. "No," she said. "They won't let Alara walk in. But they might just welcome the return of the Gilded Lily." Jed stared at her, a cold dread washing over him as he began to understand her plan. "No," he said, his voice a low, harsh command. "Absolutely not. You are not going back to being that person. Not for a second." "I am not going back to being her," she corrected him, her voice fierce. "I'm going to use her. I'm going to wear her like a mask. Thorne taught me everything about his world, Jed. He taught me how to move in it, how to speak its language. He turned me into a weapon, and tonight, I'm going to turn that weapon against him," she continued, her voice low and urgent, laying out her plan. It was audacious, reckless, and utterly brilliant. She would be his way-in. She, the Gilded Lily, his most famous, most prized possession, would appear on the arm of a mysterious, wealthy stranger. Her presence would be such a shock, such a testament to Thorne's power that he could even bring back the one who had escaped it, that no one would dare question their entrance. It would be the ultimate act of psychological warfare, played out on Thorne's own stage. Jed hated it. Every protective instinct in his body screamed at him to forbid it, to lock her in the room and face Thorne himself. But he looked into her eyes, and he saw not fear, but a cold, burning resolve. This was not just about his vengeance anymore. It was about hers. It was about her walking back into the gilded cage, not as a prisoner, but as the master of her own fate. To deny her this would be to deny her the final, most important part of her own liberation. "All right," he said, the word tasting like gravel in his mouth. "We do it your way. But the second it goes wrong, the second you give me the sign, we are leaving. No arguments." "Agreed," she said. The transformation was chilling. She washed away the dust of the trail. She braided her hair, letting it fall in a cascade of dark, shining curls over her shoulders. From the small bundle she had brought with her, she took out a dress. It was a simple, dark green traveling dress, but she had altered it subtly, adding a piece of lace at the collar, a ribbon at the waist. It was a dress that spoke of a quiet, respectable wealth. But the real transformation was in her demeanor. The quiet, resilient ranchwoman disappeared. In her place was a woman of cool, regal elegance. The way she held her head, the slight, dismissive curve of her lips, the cold, assessing look in her eyes. It was a performance, but it was a perfect one. She was the Gilded Lily again, the beautiful, untouchable prize. Jed, too, underwent a change. He shed his dusty ranch clothes for his one good suit, a dark, well-tailored outfit he had not worn since his wife's funeral. He was no longer a simple cowboy. He was a man of substance, a gambler with ice in his veins. They looked at each other in the small, cracked mirror. They were strangers, two dangerous, elegant people on their way to a deadly game. "Ready?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Ready," she replied, her voice a cool, musical murmur that was not her own. The serpent's scepter was even more opulent, more decadent, than Alara had described. It was a riot of red velvet, polished brass, and cut-glass chandeliers, a palace of sin built in the middle of the desert. The air was thick with the smoke of expensive cigars and the scent of perfume and desperation. They walked in, and a hush fell over the room. Every eye turned to them. Men stopped their card games, their drinks halfway to their lips. The piano player fumbled a note. They were staring at Alara, their faces a mixture of disbelief, shock, and a prurient, greedy curiosity. The legend had returned. A large, ugly man with a broken nose and the dead eyes of a killer Thorn's head of security. A man named Brannigan moved to intercept them. Well, Brannigan sneered, his eyes raking over Alara with a look of possessive insolence. "Look what the cat dragged in. The boss is gonna be very interested to see you." His gaze shifted to Jed. "And who the hell are you?" Before Jed could speak, Alara laughed, a cool, tinkling sound that was as artificial as it was beautiful. "Brannigan, darling," she said, her voice dripping with a bored, aristocratic condescension. "Don't be rude. This is Mr. Blackwood. He's a business associate of mine, and he's here for the game. I trust you can find a seat for him." The sheer audacity of her performance, her absolute command of the situation, stunned Brannigan into a momentary silence. He had expected a frightened, ragged fugitive. He was not prepared for this cool, confident queen. He hesitated, his small, brutish mind trying to process this new reality. Before he could refuse, a voice, as smooth and as cold as river stones, cut through the silence from the top of the grand staircase. "Let them pass, Brannigan." Marcus Thorne stood there, a vision of tailored, civilized menace. He was exactly as Alara had described, handsome in a sharp, predatory way, his eyes holding a chilling, reptilian stillness. He looked at Alara, and a slow, cruel, and genuinely pleased smile spread across his face. "My dear Lily," he said, his voice a purr of possessive triumph. "I knew you would come home eventually. All my pretty little birds do." His gaze shifted to Jed, and his eyes narrowed, a flicker of cold, analytical curiosity in their depths. "Welcome to my home, Mr. Blackwood. I am always pleased to meet a man who appreciates rare and beautiful things. Please join us. The game is about to begin." He turned and glided back into the private room, a king returning to his court. Jed and Alara exchanged a single, fleeting glance. They had passed the first test. They were in. They followed Brannigan up the stairs and into the serpent's den, the heavy, ornate doors closing behind them, shutting them in with the man who had destroyed both their lives. The final, deadly game had been dealt, and they were all in. Chapter 6, A Game of Masks. The room at the top of the stairs was the heart of Marcus Thorne's empire. It was a chamber of calculated opulence, designed to intimidate and impress. The walls were paneled in dark, polished mahogany, the air was thick with the smoke of Cuban cigars, and a massive, green felt-top table sat in the center of the room like a sacrificial altar. 4 men were already seated at the table, their faces a gallery of frontier power: a cattle baron with a face like a slab of sun-cured beef, a mining magnate with soft, pale hands and the dead eyes of a shark, a railroad man with a politician's easy smile, and Thorne himself, a black-clad serpent at the head of the table. The moment Jed and Alara entered, the conversation stopped. All eyes went to Alara, and then to Jed. Thorne, with a theatrical, magnanimous gesture, indicated 2 empty chairs. "Gentlemen," Thorne said, his voice a smooth, confident purr, "allow me to introduce an old, and very dear, friend of mine. This is Lily. She has been on a prolonged vacation. And this," his cold eyes settled on Jed, "is her traveling companion, Mr. Blackwood. He has come to try his luck with us tonight." Jed gave a curt, silent nod, pulling out a chair for Alara before taking his own. The move was subtle, but it was a clear statement. He was not her keeper, he was her escort. Alara inclined her head, a small, regal gesture. "It's so good to be home, Marcus," she said, her voice a cool, musical lie. The game began. It was 5-card stud, a game of nerve, skill, and pure, uncut avarice. Jed was not a professional gambler, but he was a man who understood risk and who knew how to read men. He had spent years reading the subtle signs of cattle, the shift in the weather, the look in a horse's eye. Reading the bluff of a rich man was not so different. He played with a quiet, unnerving calm. He bought his chips with the sack of gold, a sum that earned him a grudging respect from the other players. He folded more often than he played, watching, learning the rhythms of the table, the tells of the other men. The cattle baron was a bluffer, his jovial nature a mask for a reckless aggression. The mining magnate was a rock, playing only the strongest of hands. But Thorn was a master. He played not just the cards, but the men who held them. His eyes missed nothing. He seemed to smell weakness, to sense fear. He would raise on a weak hand, forcing a better one to fold, just for the pleasure of showing the bluff. It was not about the money for him. It was about the power, the domination. Elara sat beside Jed, a silent, beautiful ornament. She did not play. She simply watched, her face a mask of cool, detached amusement. But beneath that mask, she was a hawk, her mind cataloging every detail. She was watching Thorn, studying him, relearning the man who had been her jailer. She saw the slight, almost imperceptible tightening of the muscle in his jaw when he was bluffing, the way his fingers would drum softly on the table when he held a strong hand. She was feeding this information to Jed, not with words, but with a series of tiny, prearranged signals, the slight shift in her posture, the way she would touch the stem of her wine glass. They were a team, a silent, deadly partnership, and Thorn, for all his cunning, was completely unaware of it. He was too consumed by his own arrogance, by the triumph of her return. He believed she was here because she had finally understood that there was no life for her outside of his cage. He believed he had won. The night wore on, the stakes getting higher, the air growing thicker with smoke and tension. Jed, using Elara's signals and his own steady nerve, began to win. He didn't win big, flashy pots. He won small, steady, grinding victories, slowly but surely accumulating a small mountain of chips. He was not just taking Thorn's money, he was chipping away at his aura of invincibility, and he was doing it at his own table, in front of his most important associates. Thorn began to notice. His smile grew tighter, his eyes colder. The game was no longer a pleasant diversion for him. It had become a battle of wills between him and this silent, stone-faced stranger who had dared to bring his property back to him. The turning point came in a single, massive hand. Jed was dealing. He had a king in the hole. He caught another king on the third card. A strong hand. Thorn was showing a pair of jacks. The betting was heavy. The cattle baron and the railroad man folded, leaving just Jed, Thorn, and the tight-playing mining magnate. On the fourth card, Jed caught a queen. Nothing. Thorn caught a third jack. A very strong hand. The mining magnate caught a 10. Thorn bet a fortune. The mining magnate, after a long, agonizing moment, folded, convinced Thorn had him beat. The pot was now a dragon's hoard of gold and paper, sitting in the middle of the table. It was down to Jed and Thorn. Elara, sitting beside Jed, subtly touched the base of her wine glass with her little finger. It was the signal. He's bluffing. The third jack is a lie. He's trying to buy the pot. Jed looked at Thorn's cold, confident face. He looked at the mountain of chips. He had two kings. Thorn was showing 3 jacks. To call was to risk everything. But to fold was to lose the game, to lose this battle of wills. He trusted Elara's instincts more than he trusted his own. "I'll see your bet," Jed said, his voice a low, calm rumble, "and I'll raise you." He pushed his entire stack of chips into the center of the table. All of it. The room went completely silent. The other players stared, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. It was a move of either supreme confidence or utter madness. Thorn's smile vanished completely. He stared at Jed, his reptilian eyes trying to bore into his soul, to find a flicker of doubt, of fear. He found nothing, only a calm, unnerving certainty. He looked at Elara, a silent question in his eyes. She met his gaze, and her face was a perfect, unreadable mask. She gave him nothing. The muscle in Thorn's jaw began to jump. He had been so sure. He had been so certain he could bully this stranger out of the pot. But the stranger was not blinking. "Call," Thorn finally snarled, pushing his own chips forward. The final card was dealt. It was a formality. Kings, Jed said, turning over his whole card. He had to pair kings and queens. Thorn stared at Jed's cards, and then, with a look of pure, venomous hatred, he turned his own cards over. He had not caught a fourth jack. He had not even had a third. He had been running a massive, arrogant bluff with nothing more than a pair of jacks. A collective, quiet gasp went around the table. Jed raked in the massive pot, the sound of the chips clattering together the only sound in the room. He had not just beaten Marcus Thorn. He had humiliated him. He had stripped him bare in front of the very men he sought to dominate. Thorn rose from the table, his chair scraping back harshly. His face was a pale, tight mask of fury. "The game is over," he said, his voice a low, vicious hiss. "Mr. Blackwood, Lily, a word with you. In my office." It was not a request. It was a death sentence. Jed and Alara rose, their own faces carefully neutral. They had won the game, but in doing so, they had triggered the final, violent confrontation. They had played with the serpent, and now it was time for it to strike. They followed Thorn out of the room, the heavy doors closing behind them, sealing them off from the world, leaving them alone with the monster in the heart of his den. Chapter 7. The Gilded Cage. Thorn's office was a room designed to reflect the man himself, cold, opulent, and utterly without soul. One wall was lined with glass-fronted bookcases filled with leather-bound volumes he had likely never read. Another was adorned with a collection of antique firearms, polished and gleaming, weapons that were symbols of power, not tools for survival. A massive, claw-footed desk of dark mahogany dominated the room, and behind it, a large window looked out over the sordid, glittering lights of redemption. Thorn did not sit. He stood by the window, his back to them, a rigid, menacing silhouette against the night. The silence in the room was a physical presence, thick with a barely restrained violence. Brannigan, the broken-nosed thug, stood by the door, his hand resting on the butt of the large pistol tucked into his belt. The trap had been sprung, and they were caught in it. "Mr. Blackwood," Thorn said, his voice a low, dangerous purr, not turning round. "A fine name, a strong name, but not your name. I have had a telegraph sent. There is no Mr. Blackwood of any note in this territory. So, I will ask you once, and only once. Who are you?" Jed stood in the center of the room, his stance relaxed, his hands loose at his sides. He was a picture of calm, and Alara, standing beside him, could feel the coiled, deadly tension in him. "I'm the man who just took all your money," Jed replied, his voice a flat, unimpressed drawl. Thorn finally turned, and the mask of civilized charm was gone. His face was a mask of cold, reptilian fury. His eyes were not the eyes of a man, they were the eyes of a predator, utterly devoid of empathy or compassion. "You have done more than that," Thorn said, his voice a vicious hiss. "You have come into my house, you have sat at my table, and you have consorted with my property." His gaze slid to Alara, and it was a look of such possessive, venomous hatred that it made her skin crawl. "And for that, you will die. Slowly. But first, you will tell me who you are." "I do not like to kill a man without knowing his name." Jed gave a small, grim smile. "My name is Jedediah Harding," he said, his voice quiet, but each word landing with the force of a hammer blow. The reaction was instantaneous. A flicker of something shock, disbelief, and then a dawning, terrible recognition passed through Thorn's eyes. He stared at Jed, at the hard, weathered face, at the pale blue eyes that held a look of implacable, righteous hatred. "Harding," Thorn breathed, the name a strange, foreign thing on his tongue. "It cannot be." "Oh, it can," Jed said. "You thought you had erased us. You thought you had buried our name in the mud of the San Pedro River. But you were wrong. A piece of us survived, and he has come back to collect a debt." Thorn threw back his head and laughed, a harsh, ugly sound devoid of any humor. "A ghost," he said, a look of genuine, delighted surprise on his face. "You are a ghost, come back to haunt me. This is magnificent, more perfect than I could have ever planned." He looked at Alara, a new, sick understanding dawning in his eyes. "And you," he said, his voice dropping to a purr of pure, sadistic pleasure. "You found him, my branded little messenger. You led the lamb back to the slaughter. I knew you were a clever girl." "I am not your girl," Alara said, her voice shaking but firm. "And I did not lead him here. We came together. We came for you." "Did you now?" Thorn said, his smile widening. He took a step towards her. Jed tensed, his body subtly shifting, placing himself between them. "Tell me, Harding," Thorn said, his attention returning to Jed, though his eyes still devoured Alara. "What is it you think you will accomplish here? You are in my town, in my house, surrounded by my men. You are an army of two, a ghost and a broken toy. You cannot win." "We've already won," Jed said. "We have shown your friends what you are, a fraud who can be beaten, a king who can be toppled. And now, we're going to collect the final part of the debt." "And what is that?" Thorn asked, a look of amused curiosity on his face. Jed's gaze flickered to Alara's hands. "You have something that belongs to my family," he said. "A story, a history. You burned it into her skin, and we're here to take it back." Thorn's smile finally faded, replaced by a look of cold, hard fury. "You will take nothing," he snarled. "You will die here." And he looked at Alara, his eyes glowing with a renewed, possessive fire. "She will learn again the price of disobedience. The branding this time will not be so artistic." He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to Brannigan. But Jed and Alara were ready. They had known it would come to this. In the split second that Brannigan's hand moved towards his gun, they exploded into action. It was not a fight. It was a symphony of perfectly synchronized violence. Jed did not go for his own gun. He dove forward, low and fast, his powerful shoulder crashing into Thorn's midsection, sending the man flying backwards over his own ornate desk in a crash of splintered wood and scattered papers. In the same instant, Alara moved in the opposite direction. From the folds of her dress, she produced a small, wicked-looking throwing knife, a weapon Jed hadn't even known she possessed. She had palmed it from the table downstairs on their way in. She threw it, her motion a fluid, underhand flick. The knife flew through the air and embedded itself, with a sickening thud, in the back of Brannigan's gun hand, pinning it to the thick wood of the doorframe. Brannigan screamed, a high-pitched sound of pain and surprise, his gun falling from his now useless hand. The whole thing had taken less than 3 seconds. Jed was on his feet, his Colt now in his hand, its barrel pressed against Thorn's temple. Thorn lay amidst the wreckage of his desk, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. Alara had already retrieved her knife and was holding it to Brannigan's throat, her eyes as cold and hard as chips of ice. "Tell your men to stay out of this," Jed said, his voice a low, deadly calm. Thorn, his arrogance shattered by the sheer speed and ferocity of their attack, hesitated for only a second before giving a ragged, choked command to Brannigan, who relayed it through the door. The office was silent again, save for the sound of Thorn's ragged breathing. "It seems the odds have shifted," Jed said, his voice a low, chilling murmur. He looked at Alara, a silent question in his eyes. This was her moment. This was her reckoning. She pushed Brannigan away from the door and walked slowly, deliberately, towards the man who had been her tormentor, her jailer, her god. She stood over him, looking down at him, at the man who was now just a man, bleeding and defeated, lying in the ruins of his own power. "You tried to make me a part of your collection, Marcus," she said, her voice clear and strong, the voice of a woman who had finally, completely, reclaimed herself. "You tried to write your story on my skin, but you failed." She held out her hands, her palms facing him, the two halves of the Harding crest a silent, damning judgment upon him. "This is not your mark," she said. "It is not a symbol of your power. It is a symbol of your theft, your weakness, your failure. It is the crest of the family you tried, and failed, to destroy. And it is the story of the woman you tried, and failed, to break." She looked at Jed, and a deep, profound love, forged in fire and a quest for vengeance, passed between them. "You are not a collector, Marcus," she said, her voice ringing with the final, absolute truth. "You are just a thief. And tonight, your collection is officially closed." With a final look of utter, complete contempt, she turned her back on him. She had faced her demon. She had told her story. And she was free. The final act of justice was now up to Jed. He looked down at the man who had murdered his wife and child, the man who had tortured the woman he now loved. And he knew that the time for words was over. The debt was about to be paid in full. Chapter 8, A Debt Paid in Blood. The air in the office was thick with the metallic scent of fear and the promise of a final, violent absolution. Thorne lay on the floor, his aura of invincibility shattered, his eyes darting between Jed's cold, impassive face and the unwavering barrel of the Colt pressed against his temple. The predator had become the prey, and the terror of that realization was a new and welcome emotion for him. "You won't do it, Harding," Thorne hissed, his voice a ragged, desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control. "You're not a killer. You're a farmer, a man of the earth. You don't have the stomach for it." "You took my wife from me," Jed said, his voice a low, chilling monotone that was far more terrifying than any shout. "You took my daughter. You took this woman's childhood. You seem to have mistaken me for a man who has something left to lose. My stomach is the least of your worries right now." He cocked the hammer of the Colt, the series of clicks loud and definitive in the silent room. The sound was a death knell, but Alara stepped forward, placing a hand on Jed's arm. "No, Jed," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not like this." Jed looked at her, his eyes blazing with a righteous, murderous fury. "He deserves to die," he growled. "Yes, he does," she agreed, her own eyes as hard as stone as she looked down at the pathetic, whimpering man on the floor. "But if you shoot him now, like this, they will call it murder. His men are outside that door. We will never make it out of this town alive. His death has to be justified. It has to be a matter of honor, not an execution." She was right. Her mind, even in this moment of extreme duress, was clear, tactical. To kill him now would be to trade his life for theirs. "There is another way," she said, her gaze fixed on Thorne. "A way that a man like you, a man so obsessed with power and reputation, will understand." She looked at Jed. "Challenge him." The words hung in the air. A formal duel. A walk down, in the dusty main street of Redemption, at dawn. It was an old, almost mythic tradition of the West, a way of settling disputes that were beyond the reach of the law. It was a trial by combat. A slow, cold smile spread across Jed's face. It was perfect. It was a piece of theater that would satisfy the bloodlust of the town, that would be seen not as murder, but as justice. It would strip Thorne of the protection of his hired guns and force him to face his sins, man to man. "Get up, Thorne," Jed said, pulling the gun back slightly. Thorne scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting between them, a new, calculating light entering his eyes. He saw the opportunity they were giving him. On the street, with a gun in his hand, he still had a chance. He was a skilled duelist, having killed more than one man in just such a fashion. He thought he could still win. His arrogance was his deepest, most fatal flaw. "A duel," Thorne said, shaky, but genuine, smile returning to his face. "Excellent. I accept." "Dawn. In the main street. You and I, Harding. We will settle this the old way." He looked at Alara, his possessive smirk returning. "And when I have killed you, I will reclaim my property." "The terms are not yours to make," Jed said. He turned to Brannigan, who was still slumped against the door, nursing his skewered hand. "You will be his second. You will ensure that none of his men interfere. If they do, he nodded at Alara, who was now holding Brannigan's own pistol, its barrel pressed against the thug's sweaty forehead, "will kill you. And I will kill him. Is that understood?" Brannigan, his face pale with pain and fear, could only nod. They left the office, walking back down the grand staircase and through the now silent saloon. The word had already spread. The ghost of Harding had challenged the King of Redemption to a duel at dawn. The gamblers and the whores stared at them, their faces a mixture of awe and morbid anticipation. They walked back to their hotel room, to solitary figures moving through the charged, electric atmosphere of the town. They had won the battle, but the war would be decided in a few short hours, in a single, final, violent confrontation. They did not sleep. They sat in the small, cramped room, the air thick with unspoken fears and a profound, desperate love. They claimed their weapons, a familiar, grounding ritual. "You don't have to do this, Jed," Alara said, her voice a low, urgent whisper in the darkness. "We could leave. We could ride out now, disappear into the mountains. We could be free." He took her hand, his thumb stroking the brand of the hawk. "It would never be over, Alara," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "He would hunt us to the ends of the earth. His pride would demand it. And we would spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. There is no freedom for us as long as he is breathing. This is the only way to truly end it. To cut the head off the snake. He pulled her to him then, and held her, not with the passion of a lover, but with the fierce, tender embrace of a soldier saying goodbye. I love you, he whispered into her hair. Whatever happens tomorrow, know that you brought me back to life. You gave me a reason. That's a gift that no man can take away. The dawn came, as it always does, indifferent to the lives and deaths of men. It was a gray and forgiving dawn, the sky the color of old iron. The main street of Redemption was preternaturally quiet. The usual morning sounds of commerce were absent. The street was lined with silent, watchful figures, the entire town having turned out to witness the reckoning. Jed walked out of the hotel, Alara at his side. He was dressed in his simple, dark ranch clothes. He looked calm, his face set, his eyes clear. He was a man at peace with his decision. Thorne was waiting for him in the center of the street, 100 paces away. He was dressed in black, a theatrical, almost vampiric figure. Brannigan stood behind him, his hand in a sling. Jed stopped, leaving Alara on the boardwalk. He turned to her, and for a moment, their eyes locked. In that single, silent glance, a lifetime of unspoken words passed between them. Love, fear, hope, and a final, heartbreaking farewell. Then he turned and walked to the center of the street, to face the men who had murdered his family. They stood opposite each other, two figures in a vast, dusty arena, the rising sun casting their long, distorted shadows behind them. This is a mistake, farmer, Thorne said, his voice a low sneer. I will enjoy sending you to meet your wife. And I will enjoy sending you to meet your maker, Jed replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. Though I doubt he'll be happy to see you. Brannigan, acting as the master of ceremonies, began the countdown. On the count of 3, 1, 2. Time seemed to slow, to stretch. Alara watched, her heart a frozen lump in her chest, her hand clutching the small pistol hidden in the folds of her dress. 3. Both men drew. Thorne was fast, a blur of motion, his reputation as a gunslinger well earned. His gun cleared the holster, the barrel coming up. But Jed was not fast. He was methodical. He was sure. His draw was not a blur, it was a single, fluid, economical motion, the result of years of quiet, solitary practice. His gun came up, settled in his hand, and he fired. A single shot. It was over before it began. Thorne stood there for a second, a look of profound, almost comical, surprise on his face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He looked down at it, as if he couldn't quite believe it was there. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the ground, a puppet whose strings had been cut. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Jed stood there, his Colt smoking in his hand, a statue of implacable, final justice. He had not just killed a man. He had killed a monster. He had paid the debt. The silence was broken by a single, ragged sob. Alara. She ran to him, across the dusty street, and threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. He held her tight, his own body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and the profound, soul-shaking release of 5 years of hatred. The debt had been paid. It had been paid in blood. And as they stood there, clinging to each other in the center of the street, the first, true rays of the morning sun broke over the horizon, washing the town of Redemption in a clean, golden light. It was the light of a new day. A day that was, for the first time, truly their own. Chapter 9. Thin Marked Grave. The death of Marcus Thorne was like the felling of a great, rotten tree. The immediate, violent crash was followed by a profound, echoing silence, and then, slowly, the realization that the landscape had been permanently changed. The shadow he had cast over the territory, a shadow of fear and corruption, was gone. The crowd that had lined the streets of Redemption did not cheer. They did not rush forward. They simply watched, in a stunned, sober silence, as Jed and Alara stood, clinging to each other in the center of the street. They had just witnessed not a gunfight, but an execution, an act of biblical justice. The ghost of Harding had returned and claimed his due. Brannigan and the few remaining loyal Thorne men did not try to retaliate. Their power, which had been a reflection of Thorne's own, had vanished with the smoke from Jed's pistol. They were just thugs without a master, their menace gone, leaving only their own pathetic, cowardly cores. They silently, grimly, collected their fallen leader's body and faded away, eager to disappear before the town's shifting loyalties turned against them. Jed and Alara were left alone in the street, the rising sun warming their faces. The ordeal was over. The fight was won, but the cost had been immense, and the path forward was a new and marked territory. They did not linger in redemption. The town, with its ghosts and its greed, was not a place for them. They collected their horses, bought the supplies they needed, and rode out, leaving the town to its own sordid future, without a backward glance. The journey back to the Rocking H was a world away from their journey to redemption. They were no longer two wary allies on a desperate mission. They were a man and a woman, bound by a love that had been tested in the crucible of violence and had emerged, scarred but unbreakable. They rode side by side, their silence no longer one of tension, but of a deep, peaceful communion. They had faced the abyss together, and they had survived. When they crested the final ridge and saw the valley spread out before them, a wave of profound, overwhelming emotion washed over Alara. This was not a sanctuary she had stumbled into anymore. This was her home. She had fought for it. She had bled for it. And she had won it. The days that followed their return were quiet, gentle days of healing. They were healing not from physical wounds, but from the deep, spiritual wounds of their pasts. They moved about the ranch in a comfortable, domestic rhythm, the simple, honest work of the land a balm to their weary souls. There was one final piece of business to attend to, one last ghost to lay to rest. The journal, Jed said one evening, as they sat on the porch. He had found it in Thorne's office after the duel, tucked away in a locked drawer, the silver clasp with its hawk and mountain emblem still gleaming. He handed it to her. "It's yours, as much as it is mine now," he said. "You carried its story. You helped to bring it home." Alara took the book, its weight a heavy, tangible piece of history in her hands. She opened it, her fingers tracing the faded, elegant script of Jed's ancestors. It was a book of life, of family, of a legacy of honor. It was everything Thorne had tried to steal, and had failed to understand. Together, they read the stories. And together, they took out a pen, and in the back of the book, they added a new chapter. They wrote the story of Eliza and little Sarah, of their love and their loss. And they wrote the story of Alara, the branded messenger, and of Jedediah, the avenging ghost. They wrote of the Battle of Stone Ranch and the reckoning and redemption. They were weaving their own story into the tapestry of the Harding family legacy, a story of pain, of survival, and of a love that had risen from the ashes. The question of the brands on her hands remained an unspoken presence between them. "We could do something about them," Jed said hesitantly one afternoon, as he watched her washing her hands in the basin, the brands stark against her clean skin. "A doctor or I could," he left the sentence and finished. The idea of scarring over the brands with another mark, of fighting fire with fire, a grim and spoken possibility. Alara looked at her hands, at the hawk and the mountain. She thought for a long moment. "No," she said finally, her voice quiet but sure. "No. They are a part of my story. They are a part of our story. They are not his mark anymore. They are my scars. And they are a reminder, not of what he did to me, but of what we survived, together. They are a reminder of you." It was an act of profound, final acceptance. She was not erasing her past. She was claiming it, redefining it. The brands were no longer a symbol of her shame, but of her strength. There was one last promise to be kept. The heavy, rolled-up blanket she had been carrying when she first arrived, the one that had been on her back, still lay in the spare room. Jed had never asked about it. He had seemed to understand that it was a private, sacred thing. One morning, she brought it out onto the porch. She unrolled it. Inside, carefully wrapped, were the small, weathered bones of a child. "I found her," Alara whispered, tears streaming down her face. "After I escaped from Thorne, I went back. I spent a year, searching. I knew I couldn't rest until I found her. I found her buried in the mud, half a mile downstream. I have been carrying her ever since. I promised myself I would bring her home." Jed sank to his knees, his own body racked with a silent, heartbroken sob. The final, missing piece of his heart, the daughter he had never been able to bury, had been brought home to him. Together, they took the small bundle up to the rise overlooking the house. They dug a small grave, next to the one that held her mother. And they laid little Sarah Harding to rest, her long, painful journey finally over. As they stood there, the wind whispering through the grass, a profound sense of peace settled over them. The circle was complete. The ghosts were at rest. "You asked me to lay you to rest here," Jed said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at Alara. "I was wrong," she said, slipping her hand into his. "My life didn't need to be buried here. This is where it began." They had one final, grim task. They rode out to the Widow's Peaks, to the spot where Alara had first asked to be buried. But they did not carry a body. They carried only a shovel. They dug a deep and marked grave in the hard, rocky soil. It was not for Alara. It was a grave for the memory of Marcus Thorne. It was a grave for the hatred, the fear, and the pain he had caused. They buried the ghost of their past, leaving no stone, no marker, nothing to remember him by. They were salting the earth of his memory, just as he had threatened to do to them. As they rode back to the ranch, the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over their valley. They were no longer haunted. They were no longer running. They were simply a man and a woman, riding home. Their future was an unwritten page, a territory as vast and as full of promise as the land that stretched out before them. They were scarred, both of them, inside and out. But their scars were not a sign of their brokenness. They were the map of their survival, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of lands, after the most brutal of storms, life and love could find a way to grow again. Chapter 10. In Marked Life. The first year after the death of Marcus Thorne was a year of quiet, deliberate creation. Having spent so long defined by destruction and the ghosts of the past, Jed and Alara now dedicated themselves to the simple, profound act of building a future. The Rocking H was no longer a kingdom of solitude or a fortress under siege. It became, for the first time in a long time, a home. The work was hard, but it was a joyful, healing labor. Together, they rebuilt what had been neglected, not just in the fences and the fields, but in the small, intimate spaces of their lives. Alara, with her innate connection to the living world, planted a garden behind the house, in the same sheltered spot where Jed's wife had once tried to coax roses from the hard soil. But Alara's garden was different. It was a wild, beautiful, practical thing, a mixture of hardy vegetables, fragrant herbs for cooking and healing, and tough, resilient desert wildflowers that burst forth in a riot of color after the summer rains. It was a garden that, like her, was both beautiful and a survivor. Jed, for his part, began to build again. He added a new room onto the house, a room with a large window that faced the sunrise, a room that was not haunted by any memories but their own. He worked with a new energy and new purpose. He was no longer just maintaining a ranch. He was building a legacy, a real one, not the stolen, hollow thing Thorne had craved, but one built of sweat and honor and love. They were married by a traveling circuit judge, not in a dusty office as part of a desperate bargain, but on the porch of their own home, with the vast, silent land as their witness. Their vows were simple, heartfelt words, a quiet affirmation of the deeper and spoken vows they had already made to each other in gunpowder and in blood. The community of Absolution and the surrounding ranches, slowly, cautiously, began to accept them. The story of their stand against Thorne had become a local legend, a tale that was told and read around campfires and in saloons. They were no longer seen as outsiders or objects of fear and superstition. They were the Hardings of the Rocking H, a family forged in tragedy and violence, a symbol of the fierce and yielding spirit of the territory. Tom, the rancher who had led the misguided posse, became a good friend, a frequent visitor who would sit on their porch and share a cup of coffee and the news of the outside world. The brands on Alara's palms became a part of her story, a part of her legend. She no longer hid them. They were simply a part of her, the hands that could soothe a horse, knead bread, and, if necessary, handle a colt with deadly precision. They were the hands of a healer, a fighter, a wife, a mother. For in the spring of that first year, Alara discovered she was pregnant. The news was a gift, a miracle, a final, definitive victory over the death and sterility that had haunted both their lives for so long. The child, born in the deep, cold winter, was a boy, with his father's pale blue eyes and his mother's dark, curly hair. They named him Samuel, after Jed's father, a name of honor and legacy. His birth was the final act of reclamation. Thorn had wanted Alara to be the mother of his stolen dynasty. Instead, she was the mother of a new generation of Hardings, a generation that would be raised not in a gilded cage of lies and cruelty, but in a home filled with love, honor, and the wild, beautiful freedom of the land. One warm summer evening, as the sun was setting, Jed, Alara, and the infant Samuel were sitting on the rise that overlooked the ranch, the spot where the graves of his first family lay. It was no longer a place of sorrow for him. It was a place of peace, of continuity. Alara was humming a soft, nameless tune to the baby in her arms. She looked at her hands, holding her son, and at the brands that were now faded, a part of the landscape of her skin. The hawk and the mountain, the crest of the family she had been brought to by such a violent, circuitous path. "Do you ever think of him?" she asked softly, her gaze on the distant, twin-peaked butte where they had dug the marked grave. Jed followed her gaze. He was silent for a long moment, watching the last rays of the sun paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. "No," he said finally, his voice filled with a quiet, absolute certainty. "I don't. There's no room for him here. Not anymore." He was right. Their life, their home, their hearts were too full. They were filled with the sound of a baby's soft breathing, with the scent of a blooming garden, with the quiet, comfortable rhythm of a shared life, with a love that had been tested and had proven as strong and as enduring as the ancient, sun-baked rocks that surrounded them. The ghost of Marcus Thorn was well and truly buried. His name was forgotten. His legacy was dust. Jed reached out and put his arm around Alara, pulling her and their son close. They sat there together, a small, complete family, watching the stars begin to appear in the vast, darkening sky. They were discarded survivors who had found in each other not just a refuge, but a resurrection. Their story had begun in violence and a desperate, whispered request for a grave. But it had ended here, in the quiet, profound peace of an unmarked and infinitely precious life.